It seems like you can't go a day without hearing about fake news or how we live in a post-truth world.
Right. It's everywhere you turn.
So we thought we'd take a deep dive into this whole post-truth idea with, well, a post-truth world.
By Ken Wilber.
That's the one. You've shared some really interesting excerpts from it.
I thought they might spark some good conversation.
Definitely. Especially because Wilber seems to go beyond just blaming politicians or technology for this post-truth problem.
Which is what you usually hear, right?
Exactly.
But Wilber, he connects it to something much deeper. The stages of how we grow as humans.
Okay, now that sounds a bit like we're getting into some serious Psych 101 territory.
In a way we are. Wilber draws on the work of this other thinker, Gene Gebser, who outlined these stages of human development.
I've heard of Gebser before, but refresh my memory.
He called them archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic. And there's one more we'll get to later, integral.
Okay, so what's the connection between these stages and the whole post-truth thing?
The key here is that they're not just historical periods,
So it's not like, oh, that was back in the Middle Ages. We're past that now.
Exactly. They're stages we all go through as we grow.
And some of us get stuck along the way.
That's what Wilber argues, yeah. And he says a lot of the conflict we're seeing stems from the shortcomings of the dominant worldview right now, what he calls the green stage.
Okay, hold on. Let's unpack this. What exactly does green mean in this context?
Right, because it's not as simple as someone's favorite color.
Definitely not.
Green, in Wilber's terms, is the worldview that really took off with the information age.
The internet and all that.
Exactly. It's all about equality, diversity, questioning authority, breaking down old systems.
So in a lot of ways, it's the mindset behind the internet itself. Information should be free, everyone's connected, all of that.
You got it.
Okay, I can see that. And it makes me think about how I said I've been feeling overwhelmed by information overload lately.
Right, you mentioned that.
That's definitely a very green experience, if ever there was one.
For sure. But if this green stage is all about positive things like inclusivity, where did things go wrong?
Right, because it's not all sunshine and roses, clearly.
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And Wilber argues that in its effort to deconstruct oppressive hierarchies, green ended up rejecting any notion of objective truth.
So are you saying that by trying to level the playing field, so to speak, green accidentally threw out the very idea of truth itself?
In a nutshell, yes. And as you can imagine, that opened the door to a whole slew of unintended consequences.
Like that example Wilber gives with the Google search results.
Right.
Where searching for certain groups, like Jewish people or women, can lead you down some pretty disturbing rabbit holes online.
Exactly. And that ties directly into your point about feeling overwhelmed by information and wanting something reliable to grab onto.
It's like, how do you even navigate the internet when the algorithms prioritize popularity over accuracy?
Exactly. And it's not just Google, it's the whole online ecosystem, spreading misinformation like wildfire.
It almost feels like the internet itself, which green helped create, became a breeding ground for post-truth.
That's a really interesting point, and it's something Wilber addresses directly.
And it gets even more complicated, right? Because Wilber argues that this green aversion to objective truth also spilled over into things like political correctness and cancel culture.
Right, because while those movements often stem from good intentions.
Of course. Trying to make society more just and equitable.
Exactly. But they can also end up having some unintended side effects.
Like stifling open dialogue and making people afraid to say the wrong thing.
Precisely.
Which, ironically, can be counterproductive in the long run.
Right. It's all about finding that balance between sensitivity and open dialogue.
And this is where things start to get really interesting when we look at the political landscape.
Because this is where Wilber brings up Trump, right?
Exactly. It's like, how did someone like Trump, who seemed to defy all the norms and even the very idea of truth, rise to power?
So is he saying that it's all Green's fault, like they paved the way for Trump?
Well, it's more nuanced than just blaming one group. But Wilber argues that Green, in its rejection of certain types of hierarchies, kind of inadvertently created a vacuum.
A vacuum?
Yeah, like a sense of frustration and resentment that someone like Trump was able to tap into.
So it wasn't just about appealing to traditional conservative values, what Wilber calls the amber stage.
Right. It was about something deeper, a dissatisfaction with the way things were going, with the green worldview itself.
And that's where Trump came in, promising to drain the swamp and all that.
Exactly. Wilber calls this feeling resentiment.
Resentment.
It's this feeling of being looked down upon, talked over, ignored, and unfortunately it became fertile ground for someone like Trump, who was more than happy to exploit those feelings, even if it meant bending the truth or completely obliterating it.
Wow.
Which brings us right back to the dangers of a no-truth stance, right?
Because it might sound appealing in theory.
Sure, who doesn't love the idea of multiple truths and all that?
But as Wilber points out, in reality, it can lead to chaos and division.
And he uses Trump's constant lies and the whole alternative facts debacle as prime examples of this.
It's almost like a contradiction, isn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, the academics who once championed this idea of no objective truth, they were quick to backpedal when they saw it play out with someone like Trump.
They were like, wait a minute, this isn't what we meant.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture so far. We've got green with its good intentions but potentially disastrous consequences. And then someone like Trump exploiting the situation for his own gain.
Where do we go from here?
Right. Is there any hope for green to course correct? Or are we doomed to this post-truth spiral?
Well, don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. Wilber does offer some potential solutions, some ways in which green can be salvaged and even evolve. Wilber seems to think that green can be salvaged.
There's hope yet.
He thinks so, yeah.
Okay, I'm listening.
One of the big things he emphasizes is that green needs to start acknowledging the reality of what he calls growth hierarchies.
Growth hierarchies. Isn't that kind of a contradiction? I mean, green is all about equality and breaking down hierarchies.
Right, that's a common misconception.
Help me understand this, because it seems like we're running into a bit of a contradiction here.
Well, it's easy to hear the word hierarchy and immediately think of oppression or unfair power structures.
Right, like those are definitely not good things.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But Wilber's talking about something different.
Okay.
He sees growth hierarchies as simply recognizing that there are stages of development.
Like the ones Gebser outlined.
Exactly. And these stages, they build upon each other.
So you're not saying that some people are inherently better than others?
No, not at all. It's more about recognizing that different perspectives can be more or less complex.
More or less able to grasp the bigger picture, you mean?
Exactly. Think of it like learning to read.
Okay.
You wouldn't expect a first grader to understand Shakespeare, would you?
That would be a bit much, yeah.
They need those foundational stages of learning.
Building.
Exactly. And growth hierarchies, they acknowledge those stages of understanding, but in all aspects of life.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this actually address the problems we're talking about? Like, how does recognizing these growth hierarchies help us deal with post-truth or the polarization we're seeing everywhere?
Well, I think the key takeaway here is that it's about moving away from that us versus them mentality.
Which seems to be everywhere these days.
Exactly. And Wilber argues that if we can understand that people are at different stages of development, we can start to see those who hold different views, even those we vehemently disagree with a bit more compassion and understanding.
So instead of just writing them off as, like, the other.
Exactly.
You mentioned the amber stage earlier, which is more aligned with traditional values.
Yeah.
Is Wilber suggesting that instead of dismissing everyone who identifies with amber as, backwards or whatever, that green needs to find a way to understand those perspectives?
That's a big part of it, yeah. It's about recognizing the needs and concerns that those amber values represent.
Because they're not coming from nowhere, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Remember, Wilber argues that a lot of Trump's support stemmed from things like economic anxiety, the fear of change, a sense of losing their place in the world.
And those are valid fears, even if you might disagree with the solutions.
Exactly. And this is where that distinction between growth hierarchies and oppressive hierarchies is so important.
Because those are definitely not the same thing.
Right. Oppressive hierarchies are systems of oppression, plain and simple.
Like systemic racism or sexism, those are hierarchies that need to be dismantled, not encouraged.
Exactly. They have nothing to do with fostering growth or understanding.
So a growth hierarchy is more about recognizing that there are levels of complexity, inclusivity, consciousness.
You got it. Just like with the stages of development.
So would it be fair to say that a healthy green perspective would recognize that it's more inclusive than, say, an amber perspective? Not because green is inherently superior, but because it's further along on that path towards a more nuanced understanding of the world?
That's a great way to put it. It's not about judging or creating artificial divisions, but about understanding the stages of growth.
This is making a lot more sense now. It's like we need a more nuanced, compassionate way of dealing with our differences.
That's exactly what Wilber is advocating for. He calls it moving towards a deliberately developmental culture.
A deliberately developmental culture. Okay, now that's a new one.
It's about creating systems and structures that not only acknowledge those different stages of growth, but actively foster the evolution towards more inclusive, more encompassing worldviews.
So it's almost like we need to design our society to help us grow up.
In a way, yes, both individually and collectively.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. But how do we actually put that into practice? Where do we even begin?
Well, Wilber doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does highlight a few key areas where we can focus our efforts.
A deliberately developmental culture.
It's a big idea.
It really is.
And like you said, where do we even begin?
Right. It's not like we can just flip a switch and suddenly everyone's on board with this whole growth hierarchy thing.
Exactly.
So where do we start?
Well, Wilber talks a lot about the importance of education.
Okay, so we need to teach people about these stages of development.
In a way, yeah.
Like make it part of the curriculum.
That's part of it, but it's also about fostering critical thinking skills, emotional intelligence.
So not just memorizing facts and figures,
Right.
but helping people develop the ability to think for themselves, engage in nuanced conversations.
Exactly. Because remember, it's not about imposing one worldview over another.
Right, it's about creating a space where multiple perspectives can coexist.
And even learn from each other. Which brings us to another key aspect of a deliberately developmental culture.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Creating spaces where different stages and worldviews can interact.
So you're talking about real-world applications of those growth hierarchies, where people at different stages can learn from one another.
Exactly.
Like mentorship programs or intergenerational dialogues.
Those are great examples. And it's not just about the higher stages teaching the lower ones.
It's a two-way street.
Exactly. Because every stage has something valuable to offer.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it's about approaching those interactions with compassion and understanding.
Right, because if someone comes in with a judgmental attitude, it's not going to be very productive.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all on this journey together, just at different points along the path.
Which brings us to, I think, the most fascinating part of Wilber's vision, the integral stage.
The pinnacle of human development.
So is this like the end goal, where everyone's enlightened and we've solved all the world's problems?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. But Wilber does see integral as a stage that can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously.
Okay, help me wrap my head around that.
It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all things without falling into that trap of saying all perspectives are equal.
So it's not about saying everyone's right in their own way.
Not exactly.
Because some perspectives are clearly more harmful than others.
Right, but it's also not about imposing a rigid hierarchy.
So how do we make distinctions without resorting to judgment?
That's the challenge of the integral stage.
It's like walking a tightrope.
In a way, it is.
But how does this integral thinking actually translate to the real world? How does it help us with things like political polarization or climate change?
Well, Wilber would argue that integral thinking allows us to see the bigger picture, to approach those complex issues with a new level of creativity and understanding.
It's about embracing complexity, not shying away from it.
Exactly, and seeking out diverse perspectives, even those we might not initially agree with.
Because there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Precisely. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone, not just one particular group or ideology.
And Wilber believes that we're actually moving towards this integral stage right now.
He sees it as an emerging stage, yeah.
Even with all the chaos and division in the world.
Especially with all the chaos and division. Because Wilber argues that it's often in times of crisis that we're forced to evolve, to find new ways of being and thinking.
So there's hope yet.
There's always hope. And I think that's what makes Wilber's work so compelling. It's not just a diagnosis of our current predicament, but an invitation to participate in creating a better future.
A more conscious, more compassionate future.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
From green to integral.
And I think Wilber's book offers a really valuable lens through which to view the challenges and possibilities of our time.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about.
It does. And for our listeners out there, I think the big question is, where do you see yourself on this spectrum of human development? And what role do you want to play in creating this more integral world?
It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. As always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of ideas. Until next time.